So implicit bias refers to the brain's automatic instant association of stereotypes or attitudes toward particular groups without our conscious awareness. I have given you in this slide deck a link to the Harvard Implicit Bias Association test, which all of you will be able to go to and take, and it shows slides like this. And in North America, most people make quicker associations between European American and good as opposed to African American and good. So like we have an implicit bias where we'll put bad with African American and good with European American, or we'll put good with management and bad with labor. See, that was really a killer for me. I was like, I'm totally pro-labor. I took my implicit bias test and my brain was more quickly matching management and good and labor and bad. I was shocked. So you too can be shocked. It's good for us to be shocked. You have to sign a little thing before you go and take this test. So the more power I have, the more my brain tends to be unconsciously biased and dismissive of non-power groups. And then slide number 34 and 35, you can take a look at those. It shows you all of the different possible implicit association tests you can take. And before you take it, you have to click a little box that says that you understand that you may be upset with the results. So I'll go on to start with slide number 36 now, and people can take a look at the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. So if we think about the results of the 2016 presidential election, which have been very baffling in the United States, which have been very baffling to many U.S. citizens, you can see that one of the main tactics of the current president of the United States is to create as much as possible in-group, out-group experiences among USers. So for example, this tweet from the 7th of December 2015 just put out a very important policy statement on the extraordinary influx of hatred and danger coming into our country. We must be vigilant. And moving on, it takes our brain less time, so thinking about that as the implicit association tests, it takes our brains less time to associate love with in-group concepts than it does with out-group concepts. So we are more likely to associate love and warmth with the groups that we have a sense of experiencing belonging with. The more we focus on our in-group, the more we are rewarded by flows of oxytocin, the bonding hormone. The more oxytocin there is, the more we tend to ignore the existence of out-group folks. Power perpetuates, and people are more likely, the way that we see racism and privilege and prejudice enacted is less often, although now with our current administration, we're really working with lots of against energy. But traditionally, what we've been starting to fight against in the US is the implicit prejudice that leads us to choose people who look like us over and over again, that the people who look like us get more jobs, that the people who look like us get lower prison sentences, that the people who look like us, we have less objection to them receiving resources, more likely to get bank loans, all of these things. So the way that power perpetuates is a little bit sneaky because we're not thinking about the implicit bias that our brains are carrying. The greater our sense of belonging, the less accurately we tend to decode emotions and expressions from the outgroup. And a part of the reason for that, as we will see, is because we tend to recognize and look less at faces of people who we consider to be in the outgroup. So of course we would decode their emotions less because we're paying them less attention. Slide number 42. Also, I think, very applicable to an understanding of the recent election here in the United States. The more in-group, out-group experiences are emphasized, the more fear is evoked in men, in cisgendered men, men who were born men. are the people who are the study, who are in the study. So also really important to know that prejudice is contagious, which I think is another piece of what we're working with and living with here in 2017 USA. Exposure to racially biased nonverbal messages can increase implicit bias against racial outgroups. We all have our what's called an own race bias, a tendency to more easily recognize the faces of people of our own race. It's important to recognize that for those of us who are not explicitly racist, for those of us who even will pass the Harvard implicit association test and not associate bad with African American, that we are more likely to be affected by the shade of complexion. So, and I know this is very true for me, that I find it easier to remember the face of a person who is African American, who's been here whose family has been here for some generations, 200, 400 years, whatever, where there's less of a dark complexion. And I know that when I meet recent African immigrants who have that very gorgeous dark complexion, that I'm less able to remember their faces and less able to sort of notice them. It's like we have to ask ourselves this question: who do we see and who do we not see when we're walking in the world? Do we not see people with dreadlocks? Or do we not see people in suits? I think I have just as difficult a time recognizing and distinguishing sort of an average, middle-aged, gray-haired, suited man as I do having the ability to remember and recognize a person who has recently come from Africa with a deep black complexion. So we need to ask ourselves these questions. Who are we not seeing? Who are we carrying implicit biases against? And it's easy. This is such a good question for us because we can do it anytime that we're in public. You can scan a subway car. Where do your eyes land? Where do they want to stay? Who do you remember? Who did your eyes skip over? Who did you not see? Who did your eyes not want to rest on? Who did you not have curiosity about? Because that will tell you where your implicit biases are. Who is invisible to you? Even knowing that there are people who are invisible to us helps us to begin to ask the question. And then this study was very interesting, and you can take a look at it. It's a study that's in the PowerPoint notes. There's the URL for the study, a Yale study showing that how preschool teachers, how their attention moves in terms of people's skin color. So when we carry explicit prejudice, complexion doesn't matter to us. So people who are explicitly racist, they're racist against all shades of color. It's important to just know what our tendencies are. Here we come back to the question that Pernilla was asking, and we can start to see a bit of the inside of the human brain here as well. If we believe in pure good, we are less prejudiced. If we believe in pure evil, we are more prejudiced. Disgust sensitivity runs people and makes them dehumanize others. So here are two questions that are asked for the disgust sensitivity test. There's even a disgust sensitivity test. And in this case, as I mentioned to Pernilla, the role of disgust, the more disgust we display, the more we dehumanize others. So people with high disgust sensitivity are more likely to have a bias against interracial couples. And this bias even impacts who ends up on death row in the United States. Work by Stanford psychologist Jennifer Eberhardt and her colleagues suggests that rapid unconscious facial perceptions can have deadly consequences. The researchers had participants analyze photos of African American men convicted of murder, rating how stereotypically black the man's facial features appeared. Some of the men who had been sentenced to the death penalty, some had been given less severe sentences, though the participants didn't know which men were which. Even after controlling for relevant variables such as the severity of the murder and the defendant's facial attractiveness, socioeconomic status, and prior convictions, it turned out that Black men, this is very sad for me, were more than twice as likely to be carrying a death sentence if they had facial features that were judged by study participants as more stereotypically Black. This discrepancy only existed if the murder victim was white. The defendants were no more likely to get the death penalty if their victim was also Black. So, Stanford psychologist Jennifer Eberhardt. Now, here's the cool thing. If we come back to this, remember that I told you we were going to come back to own racial bias. When people sniff oxytocin, their own racial bias disappears. So our own racial bias that exists in every human brain is entirely based on in-group, out-group experience. As we begin to look at the people we meet with our right hemisphere, with the capacity to see them as essence, if we fully invite ourselves into that, and we notice where it is hard, and we notice where we invisibilize, and we begin to claim all humans as our own, then our own racial bias disappears.